Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in London. I say that not just to be polite, but also as a statement of the industry. What I mean by that is that there is this extraordinary global experiment occurring here in the UK where the ambitions of the government is to bring its entire population online, and to do so in an extraordinarily ambitious and demanding timeline. What's interesting about that, besides the scale and scope of the effort of Government Verify, is that it really brings to light some of the most fundamental challenges of identity. And as Simon mentioned, identity is maybe best viewed in terms of identity relationship management. It talks about the relationships within the enterprise between employees and contractors, as Simon pointed out. But here in the UK, we have the overlay of the relationship between the government and its citizenry. It's also the relationship between the UK government and this global ecosystem around identity. That global ecosystem is interesting because it really has kind of two points of reference. One is a European view, which takes a regulatory approach to managing identity, relationships, commercial, government, etc. And the other is that which is probably best exemplified by companies that are centered in a small part of the US called the Silicon Valley, where it's kind of a no rules, wild, wild west approach to identity, privacy, security, etc. So what's so interesting and so important about what's happening here in the UK is that Britain has kind of one foot in Europe and one foot in North America. And that's both the challenge and opportunity that we have. And again, the ambition of the government here to bring all of its services online is certainly not unique to the UK. Governments all over the world are trying to wrestle with the challenges of declining budgets and increased demand for citizen services. And the only way that you can do that is to bring those services online. But you can't do that unless you address some of the fundamental challenges of identity. Challenges of identity that we've been grappling with for the 10 years that this meeting has occurred and beyond that. I like to think of those four fundamental challenges, the inhibitors to the kinds of systems that Simon described and that you live with on an everyday basis as these four horsemen. I use that analogy because it's both the perception of the problem and the mechanics of the problems that are so challenging to you, whether you're in public service or the private sector or in this increasingly gray area between the two. To be sure, there's lots of technical challenges, but companies like Ping, ForgeRock, and the other folks that are in the exhibit hall have, I think, a lot of assets and a lot of resources to bring to bear on technical interoperability. As a matter of fact, the technical capability that we have globally is far outstripped the other capacities that we have from a legal and business and governance point of view. And it's those issues that the organization that I represent, the Open Identity Exchange, is best suited to address or seeks to address. And they can be collapsed into these four categories that I have. It's kind of the conversation stopper. When many of you are in project meetings in your companies and organizations talking about going digital, talking about bringing services online, talking about identity relationship management, someone will say, well, what about liability? And then all of a sudden you can just feel the air leave the room. So what we've tried to do at the Open Identity Exchange is to take these difficult challenges head on. The challenges of liability, who's responsible for what, who pays when things go wrong, the issues of certification, which is really a notion of how do we trust each other. what are those trusted transactions that our systems rely on? In adoption, how do we create a solution set that involves business, legal, and technical interoperability, and how might that be promulgated throughout our organizations and the organizations that we interoperate with? So today I wanted to briefly touch on these, but talk about governance in particular. And governance is a particular challenge today. It'll be a particular challenge to the rollout of the UK government's Verify program, because we're increasingly living in a world, but certainly an internet, which has been called by Kim Cameron at Microsoft a zero trust environment. You have to assume that you can't trust anybody. That's best practice. It's unfortunate, but for security professionals, that's nothing new. But for the work that we do, it's yet a new complication to an already wicked problem of identity. That zero trust means that we have to continually innovate and continually test new propositions about the fundamental assumptions of identity relationship management in this zero trust world, where websites can be hacked, where banks are particularly vulnerable, and where identity theft is increasingly rampant. So how do we do that? Well, the organization that I'm a part of, Open Identity Exchange, tries to do that by time-worn, tested programs where we pilot different solution sets. We talk about the results of those pilots in white papers, and we try and have workshops on a regular basis. What's important about how we do this is that we do this in the open. We have competitors collaborate, and we have stakeholders at the table that are watching these pilots, these alphas, these discovery projects, and share the results. It's a new way of working together, competitors competing, different stakeholders at the same table, but frankly, it's the only way that we can make progress and have some traction on these seemingly intractable issues of adoption, of governance, of liability, et cetera. It's also important to mention that it's been an approach that's been adopted by Cabinet Office here in the UK. The kind of companies on the board of OIX are Microsoft and Google, ForgeRock, Ping, Experian, Equifax, the major players in identity. Or another way of thinking about it is the one thing that our membership has in common is a need for trusted transactions. We need to find new ways of transacting on the internet in ways that can be reliable and repeatable at great scale and across jurisdictions. So much to our surprise, a couple of years ago, the Cabinet Office joined the board of directors of the OIX, and that was part and parcel of this twofold agenda that your government has. One is to look at new ways of procuring services, particularly identity services, and this notion that this government, like other common law countries, don't have the benefit of a government-issued identity or identifier, but rather are choosing to use commercial services to leverage the identities that you've created with service providers and identity providers today in the service of providing government services. It's a radical notion, it's an interesting one, and it's an experiment that's occurring as we speak and touches all of you, British citizens who are in the room. So to its credit, the Cabinet Office has been rigorous in alpha programs, pilot programs, and using this mechanism of openly collaborating with suppliers and identity providers in the British ecosystem, if you will, the British marketplace. And I think it's to their credit that they've taken that approach. Other governments have chosen not to provide so much work on the front end. To our great embarrassment, Obamacare was launched without a particular notion of testing identity management and enrollment and single sign-on. And a couple of $1 trillion later, we're beginning to figure out that there must be a better way of doing that. So that's the kind of approach that my organization takes, and the work that we do, which is largely centered here in the UK. But we find often that pilot programs like we currently have with the 4 mobile network operators in the UK, trying to sort out a common set of standards and a common approach to the provisioning of identity, especially for the consumption of that identity by a government service, is really a wicked problem. But it turns out that the 4 identity providers in the US are having the same kinds of issues. Luckily, OIX and organizations like the GSMA are helping create those pilots and those workshops and those white papers that can be instructive to all the stakeholders and how that might occur. So whether it's the work that we're doing with mobile network operators, the work that we're doing here on the user journey with the UK government and identity providers, this iterative approach, of course, is very sensible. And it's the only way to work, but it's an interesting way of working out in the open, using open standards and this approach around interoperability, not just on a technical level, but also legal and business interoperability. So I'd like to talk to you today very briefly about this notion that we have around a trust mechanism. And again, what we want to do is to talk about trust in a somewhat mechanistic way. I trust my wife, and she trusts me, and for the last 29 years, it's allowed us to do a lot of transactions, a lot of reliability and repeatability of experience, so much so that I can begin a sentence and she will finish it for me and then introduce the next topic without me having to provide much more input. But that's another story. The thing about trusted systems is that we deliberately want to leverage them. Whether those silos are organizations within the businesses that you help lead or government services, we have to find a way of leveraging data in one silo and applying it to the benefit of services in another. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we do that in a zero trust environment? How do we do that in a way that protects the privacy as well as the security of those involved and the systems involved? So we know from past experience, this is a Yellow Pages in the US, the pre-digital notion that if we list some of those attributes, some of that personally identifying information, your name, your address, your phone number, we begin to have some of the leverage that we talked about. We can begin to create the metadata that is fueling this enormous and very profitable expansion of identity systems. And we know that directories are an important part of how the internet works. The DNS is the connective tissue for this massive enterprise and infrastructure that we rely on so increasingly. And we know that if we can sort out an exchange, we can grow markets. So Open Identity Exchange is quite deliberately named because we have an ambition around providing both the rules and tools, the technology tools from an interoperability point of view, but also the rule set, how we are to transact and exchange information, data about who we are, personally identifying data, or the attributes that are the new oil of the internet. And we know that if we register things, if we have a registry, that also helps build trust. It gives some provenance to where this data came from, who touched it, who owns it, or who thinks they own it, and who's monetizing it. Even dogs have registries. The American Kennel Club is a wonderful registry. It allows buyers and sellers of dogs to transact in a trusted way. But it turns out there's no registry for identity. There's no trusted way that competitors, multiple stakeholders, can have the visibility into the exchange of information, whether that's massive enterprise-oriented information about identities, both the identities of people, also the identities of things, increasingly so. So wouldn't it be helpful if we had a registry? So what I'm here to tell you about is the ambition and the pilot that OIX is just launching now, where we intend to build a registry. And we want to build a registry, use this time-worn notion of a registry because we want to build trust. And what trust does is that it enables interoperability. It allows us to create trusted transactions. And it, most importantly, allows us to increase the volume and the velocity and the variety of transactions. So while we never anticipated that a government would join the Open Identity Exchange, which is made up of industry leaders in this space, it kind of makes sense. Because if you think about the UK government as yet another enterprise, which manages a whole bunch of identities, 50, 60 million Britons, its challenges in many respects are the same as other enterprises, some of them on the board of OIX. As a matter of fact, you think about the 4, 5, or 6 companies that manage over 1 billion identities. Of course, it's the government of China, the government of India, but it's also Facebook. It's also Google. It's also Microsoft, perhaps PayPal and others. So we live in a world of identity management, identity relationship management, where the meme has gone from it's the government that issues identities and manages identities to now private sector, global players are managing identities at scale. And managing that identity at scale is another way of creating trusted transactions between people and organizations. The other thing that's so interesting about what's happening in this experiment, the Identity Assurance Program in the UK, is it's a twofold goal, as best I understand it. Francis Maud talks about not only getting a good deal for the British taxpayer by using commercial identities and collaborating with identity providers in the provisioning of services, but it also speaks to the development of a UK marketplace around identity relationship management that's fueled by the data, the attributes that are the economic engine of companies like Facebook, Google, and others. As a matter of fact, just yesterday morning, the new CEO of Microsoft began to talk about how Microsoft will begin to mine data within its products to provide a more social experience. So you can see several dimensions to that. A new level of services and value of leveraging data that's in Outlook. But also you can see Microsoft responding to the market dynamics where social and other search providers have this enormous growth and profitability. So all of us are changing, whether it's a tried and true player in the IT space like Microsoft, whether it's Facebook's continued services, or incredibly so, the Apple announcements around becoming a payment system unto itself. So how does it work? Well, we're taking the same approach, and we're asking industry leaders to lead. We're asking Google, Microsoft, Ping, ForgeRock, Salesforce, and other identity players to create a system of trust, of self-certification. So what we're going to do is to ask those players to create a self-certification mechanism where they will publicly attest that they are in conformance, in this case with a standard called OpenID Connect. And that by that public attestation, they do two things that are very important. One is they put their brands on the line. And in the US, we'd say that it would invite class action lawsuits, that if they've publicly attested that they are compliant with this standard called OpenID Connect, that's quite a profound thing. There's no more important asset than their brand. They also publicly invite the scrutiny of their competitors. So we think that by having competitors make this same public attestation and register that attestation on this platform that we're calling OIXNet, that we can begin to introduce a new trust mechanism into the marketplace, where we have a neutral, non-profit, technology-agnostic platform where companies, perhaps governments, can fully and transparently disclose the business, technical, and legal requirements of self-certification and interoperability to create trust. So what we think we can do in this new trust registry, OIXNet, is address these fundamental challenges of identity management. Last point is, why OIX? Well, we think that we have some credibility on a global scale because not only are we a team of rivals, Google and Microsoft are intense rivals, but we have rival sectors, telecom, data aggregators, et cetera. So we're asking these companies, global leaders in identity, to come up with a new trust mechanism, a new registry, and we're going to pilot that. So I'd like to invite all of you, your public scrutiny, to this notion of a trust registry. We're in the very beginning stages. We're piloting it. We won't announce it until spring of next year. But we want to involve companies like yours, professionals like you, and kind of noodling about how a trust registry might be of interest and of value to you and the communities of interest that you're a part of. You're part of the British citizenry, but it could be that soon in the next few years, groups of companies that want to collaborate, that compete with each other, might create a set of business, legal, and technical requirements that they can publicly expose and that they can ask folks to publicly attest their conformance to that set of trifold requirements. We think that public attestation, putting your brand on the line, the transparency that comes with that, can be an important trust mechanism, can be the underpinning of trusted transactions at a higher level of volume, velocity, and variety. So this notion of trust is key. Trusted transactions are what identity is all about. And we hope that OIX in this OIXNet registry can be a tool for trust for not only the industry leaders that are starting out on this path, but organizations and companies like yours. Thank you very much, and look forward to talking to you later.